I'm Brittany Lewis with Forbes Breaking News. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell took to the Senate floor Wednesday to blame Democrats for inflation. According to data released Wednesday by the Labor Department, prices rose 9.1% in the 12 months ending in June. The spike hit a worse than expected 40-year high after an unprecedented surge in gas prices. The Kentucky Republicans said the rapid inflation was, quote, fueled directly by the reckless spending spree the Democrats rammed through on party line just last year. Here's more from Senator McConnell.
This morning, this all-Democratic government produced yet another absolutely terrible inflation report. Inflation during the month of June shattered the experts' predictions. We are now, listen to this, at 9.1% annual inflation. Yet another fresh 40-year high, the most out-of-control inflation that American families have seen since the early 1980s. Food costs are up more than 10%. Energy costs are up more than 40%. The cost of the fuel that drives us to work, delivers our goods, drives our economy, are all up over 60%. These are staggeringly bad numbers, and they were fueled directly by the reckless spending spree that Democrats rammed through on party line just last year. Remember, right before the $2 trillion spending spree, President Biden said, quote, the biggest risk is not going too big. It's if we go too small. The Senate Democratic leader said, quote, I do not think the dangers of inflation, at least in the near term, are very real. These were gigantic unforced errors. One leading economist recently said the so-called American Rescue Plan was, quote, arguably the biggest fiscal policy mistake in several decades, end quote. Our core inflation rate here in America is more than 2 percentage points higher than in Europe. Inflation is uniquely bad here because our all-Democratic government has made uniquely bad choices. And now American families are dealing with the fallout every single day. It's no secret how much the American people disapprove of the course Washington Democrats have put us on. They say so in poll after poll after poll. So you might think by now that our colleagues would be ready to try a different approach. Well, guess again, President Biden and his party, fresh off the spending America into inflation, now want to tax hike us into recession. They're behind closed doors playing around with what may amount to the single largest tax increase in American history. Tucked inside are exactly the sort of radical ideas that working families can least afford right now. They want a giant tax hike on pass-through small businesses, a category, listen to this, that encompasses 95% of all businesses in the country, 95% of them. Take it from a constituent of mine in Mount Sterling, Kentucky, who put it this way: small businesses are already in a struggle to survive with all the taxes and regulations we have to deal with. Adding another tax is only making things worse. Democrats also want a so-called methane fee that amounts to a big new tax on domestic natural gas. While their inflation has pushed American families' natural gas prices and electricity costs up through the roof already. If following reckless spending and runaway inflation with a gigantic, painful tax hike sounds like a bad idea to you, believe me, you're not alone. Even some House Democrats are lighting their hair on fire over what a terrible idea these discussions are. One House Democrat from New Jersey is telling reporters that she is, quote, not for any type of legislation that raises taxes, especially right now as my constituents are facing inflation, cost of living increases, and housing prices. Well, Madam President, let me put it this way. When House Democrats from the Northeast start trying to sound more like Ronald Reagan running against Jimmy Carter, you know they've gotten themselves into a fix. Too bad every single House Democrat except one and every single Senate Democrat voted for the $2 trillion mistake that brought us to where we are. The Democrats complaining about inflation today voted in lockstep for the bill that brought us here. And now their answer to picking families' pockets once is to now pick the families' pockets yet a second time. The same Democrats who spent us into inflation now want to tax us into recession. Now, on an entirely different matter, this week I've been discussing the historic term the Supreme Court just concluded, the most consequential and pro-Constitution term since Brown overturned Plessy almost 70 years ago. Back in 2015, in one fell swoop, the Obama-Biden administration took aim at domestic energy production, harmed the separation of powers, and attacked the rule of law. Remember, after Americans elected Republicans in 2010 to place a check on the left-wing agenda, President Obama infamously said he would just ignore the will of the people and work around Congress. Here was his quote. He said, "I've got a pen." He said, "I've got a phone." Thus began a whole series of unconstitutional power grabs by the executive branch, a sort of crime spree against the Constitution. For example, when Democrats could not get harmful and unpopular environmental restrictions through Congress because the people's duly elected representatives did not support them, the bureaucrats at the Obama EPA decided to pretend that some obscure lines in an old law actually gave them enormous sweeping regulatory powers to manage our economy, which nobody had ever noticed before. The EPA effectively wrote and passed a giant piece of legislation, the so-called Clean Power Plan, as one branch of government acting alone. They tried to make law without involving actual lawmakers. The Obama EPA just up and decided they would start giving orders and issuing edicts and remake our country's electricity grid by brute force. Of course, the pretext was simply false. As Justice Scalia once wrote, Congress does not alter the fundamental details of a regulatory scheme in vague terms or ancillary provisions. It does not, one might say, hide elephants in mouse holes. When the legislative branch actually intends to hand over giant chunks of our power to unelected bureaucrats, we make it pretty darn clear. The Obama-Biden EPA had no lawful authority to grab control of electricity generation all across America. And that is exactly what the Supreme Court affirmed last month. The ruling was a huge win for American ratepayers and anybody who wants affordable and reliable energy. But it was also a landmark legal victory for our very system of government. The Supreme Court applied the plain text of the law and reaffirmed that the unelected administrative state is not allowed to reach way beyond the powers that Congress has actually given it. With any luck, this will be the part of a sea change that's been a long time coming. Remember, a few months ago, a young district judge in Florida applied the plain, straightforward text of a statute and overturned the administration's illegal and unilateral risk mask mandate for public transportation. That was the Centers for Disease Control stepping way, way over its boundaries. And this past January, the Supreme Court put the brakes on President Biden's blatantly illegal attempt to have the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, force 84 million American workers to get the COVID vaccine, whether they wanted it or not. As Justice Gorsuch wrote in concurrence back then, the central question we face today is who decides. The only question is whether an administrative agency in Washington charged with overseeing workplace safety may mandate the vaccination or regular testing of 84 million people. Or, Justice Gorsuch continued, whether that work belongs to state and local governments across the country and the people's elected representatives in Congress. On issue after issue, our courts are beginning to answer that question the way the Constitution commands. Who decides is the question. The answer, the people decide, and the members of Congress they elect.